In this video, we're going to look at how to set up drag and drop interactions from scratch. We'll start with a very basic interaction with one drag item and one drop zone. Then we'll look at how to create a more complex sorting activity. And finally, we'll improve on that activity to add delayed feedback. In this video tutorial, we're going to set up some drag and drop interactions. The quickest way to add a drag and drop interaction to your lesson is to use a template. So you could add a matching drag and drop, where each drag item goes into a specific zone. Or you could add a sorting drag and drop, where you have a variety of drag items that you must sort into, say, 3 zones. These templates also allow you to have distractors which don't belong in any category. But let's say you have a small interaction. Well, you can build something from scratch. For example, let's make an intro to make sure our learners are paying attention. So first I'll add some text for some instructions. And I'll just paste in some text. And what we're going to do is add a couple of images, a key, and a car, and what we'll do is have the learner drag the key into the car, and that will start the lesson. So I'll come over to my image object, select that, add one to my page, and then double click. And here's my key, so I'll select that. We'll add another image, and I'll choose my car. And I'll place this over here, and the key over here. And the next thing that we need to do is add a drag and drop object. So we'll come over to the objects and scroll down. And here is my drag and drop object. So we'll add one of those. And it doesn't matter if I place this on the screen or off the screen, it's not going to show at runtime. So in order to set up this interactivity so that our key is draggable and our car is droppable, what we need to do is set up an action. So with the drag and drop object selected, I'll come over to my action canvas. And here I will choose this when drag and drop 1 on load, pair drag object to correct drop zone. So I'll grab this and add it to my action canvas. So this has 2 sockets here, and it's expecting a reference to an object for each one. We want to use the key as our drag item, so I'll select that. And here I will choose this light green action block, which is a reference to the object itself. And I will add that as my drag object. And then I'll do something very similar for my car, so I'll select it. I will grab the reference to the object itself, and I'll put that in here. Now when I preview, I can see that I can pick up the key, and if I drop it over the car, it will stay there. And I layered these incorrectly. The car is above the key, so I can rearrange them by just dragging them in my cast. And now if we preview again, it's sitting on top. So eventually we'll probably hide that key, so it doesn't really matter, but we'll leave it like this for now. So this is good. We have a drag item and we have a droppable zone. And technically, if we look at this action, it's the correct drop zone. We don't really care about correct or incorrect in this activity. It's not like there are multiple drop areas, but it's fine for our purposes. Now we can actually do something. So we can detect when the key has been dropped on the car, and then play a sound or move on to the next page, or whatever we want. In this case, what we'll do is we'll show some text, we'll wait a second, and then we'll move to the next page. So I'm going to go back to my drag and drop object, and from the flyout panel, I'll grab this when do trigger block. And here I have some different choices for my triggers. And because our interaction is so simple, many of these will actually work for our purposes. So on drop any zone would work for our purposes. Or we could use on drop correct zone, or on drop all on zone, or all correct. But we don't have to be terribly specific because we only have one drag item and one drop zone. So I'm going to do a couple different things. I'm going to show some text, so I'll need some text. Scroll up, grab a text object, and I'll type in some text. And let's spruce that up a little. And I'm also going to uncheck the start visible property on that text object because I want to show it after they've dropped something. So I will then tell this text object to show. So I'll select it, come over to this show room, and put that in there. I can also hide the key at this time. So I'll select that object, and I will grab the hide block. Then I want to wait a second. So I'll come over to the Control tab and choose Wait 4 seconds. And I'll wait for 2 seconds. And then I'll try to go to the next page. So we'll come to the Page tab and choose Go to Next Page. So I don't currently have a page 2, so I'll quickly add one in now. So I'll go over to the Flow and click on the New Page icon. And I'll just put a placeholder here for now so that we can confirm that it's working and we don't just see a blank white screen. So I'll return to page 1 and preview. So now if I pick up this key and place it over here, it doesn't count as a drop. But if I pick up the key and place it on the car, the key hides, the text shows, and then after 2 seconds, we move on to the next page. So let's spruce this up a little bit more. The first thing that I'm going to do is hide the key. So I'll move this up. And then I'm going to also show the text. So I've basically just rearranged these. And then I'm going to wait for 1 second. And I'm actually going to move this car off screen to the right. So I'm going to come over to the Move tab. And I'm going to choose this move towards right by some amount of pixels. So I'll grab this, place it in here, and then I want to move the car, so I'll select that, grab the reference to the car object, and place that in here. And I want it to move to the right by, I'll say 500 pixels. Not sure if that's quite enough. And I don't want to initiate the car moving and then jump to the next page immediately. So I'm going to add another wait block between these. So I'll right click and say duplicate. And I'll wait for 2 seconds. So now when we preview this, once I drag this and drop it onto here, I see the room message, the car disappears, we wait a few seconds before I move on to the next page. So that's a little activity that you can add to your lesson to make it a little more fun. Now, if you want to create something similar to one of our template, but just different enough that the template won't work for you, you can build your own. So I've added some objects here on page 2. I've gone ahead and added a number of images and a couple of shape objects and some text fields that are going to act as labels. When you're building a drag and drop, names and layering are important. Luckily, each of these images came in with an appropriate name, so I don't have to worry about that too much. But for these shape objects, I'll need to rename them and also make sure that they're layered below what are going to become my drag items. So these are already layered at the bottom, and I need to rename these objects, so I'll double click on them, and I'll call this one my reptile drop zone, and this one I will call my mammal drop zone, or DZ for short. Next, I need to add a drag and drop object. So I'll come over to the objects and scroll down and add a drag and drop. And here, just like on the previous page, I need to associate these drag items with some drop zone. So again, I'll come over to the action canvas and choose this drag and drop on load, pair drag objects to drop zones. So I'll go ahead and set up my first one. I'll grab this fox and grab the light green object reference. And this will be my drag object, so I'll place it in here. And a fox is a mammal, so I'll select my mammal drop zone and grab that object reference. So in order to set up the rest of them, I can just right-click and duplicate. And I'll just keep doing that for all 9 of them. And then I'll point to some different objects in here. So we'll start with the bear, the deer, fox is already set, frog, lizard, Alright, and then I'll go through these and I'll make sure that they're associated with the correct drop zone. So bear, deer, fox, frog we'll come back to. Lizard is not a mammal. And the snake and the turtle are not mammals either. So this frog is not a reptile and it's not a mammal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just get rid of this drop zone. And I'll leave this part of the action block blank. So the frog is a drag object, but it has no associated correct drop zone. It's basically a distractor, so the correct position for the frog is going to be right where it is. So let's go ahead and preview this and make sure that our drag items are draggable and our drop zones are droppable. So far so good, but we do run into a problem. Even though these drop zones are pretty wide, the way that these are stacking, they're not all going to fit. So what it's trying to do is place this bear down below these already dropped items, and it doesn't fit. So it gets pushed back to its original position. Same thing is going to happen here once we fill it up. So I could change the layout here and make these a lot more vertical, or I can go to my drag and drop and change one of the properties. So let's do that. I'll select my drag and drop object, and I'll come over to the properties panel. And here I'm going to choose a different drop layout. So I don't want center. I'm going to choose flow. And then if we preview again, now when I drop things in here, it's going to move the first item into the top left-hand corner, and then the next item after that. Some of these images are pretty tall, so if I have this deer on one line and this frog on another line, it doesn't quite fit. So I might need to adjust this to allow enough space so that any items can go anywhere, so it's not an indication that these items don't go in there. So I'll change the height of this. So I'll select the deer, and I can see that its height is 109, and the frog is 98. So I think my drop zone is 200 pixels tall. So I'll give it a bit more breathing space at 220. And I'll do the same for my reptile drop zone. I'll change the height, so it's 220. So now they should both fit in there. Yep. Now we can do some fun stuff with some feedback. When do we want feedback? When they click on a button, or when everything is dropped, or immediately? We have a lot of different options. In this case, let's start with some immediate feedback. So I'm going to create another action here. I'll select my drag and drop object, and I'll grab this when do block. And I'll give myself a bit more space for my actions here. So we're going to get some immediate feedback. So as soon as they drop something, we're going to show whether it's correct or incorrect. So to do that, I'll change this onDrop any zone to onDrop correct zone. And I'll set up the correct immediate feedback first. So if they drop something correctly, what I want to do is show some sort of correct indicator on the correctly dropped object. So if we go back to the drag and drop tab and scroll down, I can see this show indicator correct one on correct objects. So I'll add that. And this is going to show a correct indicator on the correct objects on the outer left center. So let's preview this and see if it works. And it does. So when I drop these things correctly, it's going to show me this check mark. Now I don't really want it to be off to the left because it starts to interfere with the next drag item. So in my case, I'll put it at the bottom. So I'll come back to the action, and I will change this outer left center to outer center bottom. And then we'll preview this again. And that works out a little bit better. I could also choose to have it right in the center by choosing inner center. But there is a slight problem here. Technically, this is showing the correct indicator on everything that is dropped correctly at the moment. Technically, this frog is dropped correctly. It doesn't belong in either of these categories, so it's getting a check mark as well. And we don't really want that. So we need to change what this is pointing to. So we don't want to show it on all of the correct objects. Instead, what we want to do is just show it on the last item that was dropped. So I'll come back to the drag and drop and look in the flyout panel. And luckily I have this drag and drop one, last object dragged. So I'll add that, and I don't really want it to be the last object dragged. I want it to be the last object dropped. So I'll choose that in this drop-down list, and then I'll put this in here. Now when we preview it, it's showing the check mark only on the last item that was dragged. And this frog isn't showing his cards too early. So this works pretty well for correctly dropped things. What about incorrectly dropped things? Well, we can just right-click and duplicate this entire action. And I can change the trigger from onDrop correct zone to onDrop incorrect zone. And when they drop it incorrectly, I don't want to show a correct check mark. So I'm going to change this dropdown to my incorrect one large. And then I'll preview again. And so if I drop this snake, I get a red X. And if I don't like the way that this particular feedback looks, I can try out my incorrect 2 and my correct 2. And that uses a different style of checkmark and a different style of X. So once these things start wrapping onto another line, I'm going to run into some issues again. I've got kind of too much feedback going on here all at once. So I can add one final action. So I'll right-click and duplicate. And this time what I'll do is I will hide all my indicators the next time something is dragged. So I can change my trigger to onDrag any object. And I want to show indicator none on pretty much everything. So get rid of that and go back to our drag and drop flyout panel. And here I can grab this drag and drop one correct objects and change the dropdown to all drag objects. And now when I preview, I get my correct feedback, and then as soon as I go to pick up something else, that feedback goes away. Here I get my negative feedback, and as soon as I pick up something else, it goes away. Immediate feedback is nice and has its place for exploration type activities, but it doesn't really challenge our learners or force them to think about their choices. There's no risk to just trying anything and no incentive to think about what they're doing. So let's change this activity to use delayed feedback instead. So I'll keep this one here and I'll create a copy of this page to add my delayed feedback. So I'll come over to the flow and right click and choose Flow Duplicate. And I'll change the name of this new copy of the page to Delayed Feedback. So if I ever change my mind, I can always go back to page 2 and have my immediate feedback. So let's start changing this. I don't need any of these actions anymore, so we'll delete all of them. This action here is still useful. It's pairing my drag items with the appropriate drop zones, or in the case of the frog, no drop zone. And from here, I'm going to add a submit button. So I'll scroll up in my objects to the button, and we'll add a button and change the label to submit. So when they click that submit button, we're going to check to see if everything is dropped correctly. And if so, we want to show some correct feedback, and if not, we'll show some sort of incorrect feedback. So I could show all my individual feedback, but just show it at the end. But I like the idea of not telling them specifically what they got right or wrong, and instead just telling them whether they got the whole activity correct or not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to my stack here, and I'm going to create 2 more layers, one for my positive feedback and one for my negative feedback. So I'll give myself a bit more room, and I'm going to add a layer, and this layer is going to house my positive feedback. So I'll change the name to correct feedback, and then I'm going to add a shape object. I'll put it over here on the left, and I'll change the style to make it green, and we'll add some text. Which I'll make bold and white and a larger font size. And I'll add a button that says continue, which will move on to the next page. So next I will right-click and duplicate this correct feedback to create my incorrect feedback layer. So right now it's called Core FB1, so I'll change that name and call it incorrect feedback, and say that's not right. I'll change my button to say retry, and I'll make my background red. And while I'm here, I might as well set up these two actions for the buttons. So when they click the retry button, I will have the page reload. So I'll go to my Page tab and choose Reload Page. And when they click on the Continue button, I will go to the next page. Alright, so how do we get the appropriate feedback to show? Well, we're not going to set it up on the drag and drop object directly. We have a submit button now. So we created this submit on click trigger earlier. So let's return to that. And what we want to do is add a if block. So I'll go to the Control tab and I'll choose the if do else block. And here we need to ask the drag and drop object how many correct objects have been dropped. So I'll go over to the drag and drop object, and in the flyout panel, the one that I want here is the correct object count. So we'll add that in here, and then if I want to, I can put in 9, since there are 9 drag items. Or I can duplicate this and get the total drag object count, which should also be 9. And I can right-click and say external inputs if I'd like, so that the action isn't quite so long. So here, when they click on the submit button, we're checking to see if the correct object count is equal to the total drag object count. That means they got everything correct. So if that's the case, we're going to select our correct feedback layer and tell that to show. And if the correct object count is anything less or different than our total drag object count, we're going to show our incorrect feedback. So I'll tell that to show by selecting it and then choosing the Show Incorrect Feedback from the flyout panel. And these are already set to not start visible, so let's go ahead and preview this. And I'll get it incorrect first, so we'll drop some of these correct and some of them incorrect. Then I'll click my submit button, and I get my incorrect feedback. And then I'll click retry, and the page reloads back to its original state. So let's get it correct this time. And we'll leave the frog here. And now I get my correct feedback. So if I click continue, it tries to go to the next page, but I don't have a next page. There's one last issue here, and that is people can still drag their items around and confuse themselves. So there's a number of ways to fix this by disabling some of these drag items, but probably the easiest thing to do is just put a large mask over the drag and drop activity area. I'll also hide the submit button when they're viewing the feedback. So what I'll do is I'll add a mask into my feedback layers. And we'll move this below everything else. Call it mask. I will make it semi-transparent, so I'll set this to about 50% transparency and change the fill to a gray color. And get rid of the line. And then I will copy this mask and paste it into my incorrect feedback and make sure it's layered below all the other stuff. And then finally, I will tell that submit button to hide when they click on it. So I'll return to the base, select the submit button, and grab the hide submit. And we'll do that before the if conditional. So now if I get this correct or incorrect, I get my feedback, my submit button disappears, and these masks are keeping me from grabbing these objects and moving them around. That's it for this video. There are a lot of things that you can do with the drag and drop. For example, we could have shown individual text-based feedback for each wrong item, or we could have set up feedback based on drop zones rather than the drag items, or we could have stored what they dropped in a particular zone and use that to display particular information later on in the lesson. We would probably use variables and lists to help with that. The point is, there's a ton of flexibility with the drag and drop object, so be sure to look out for more video tutorials, and feel free to experiment.